What I thought we'd do is invite Professor Simone to make introductory remarks on the three, perhaps beginning by talking about these three concepts that are listed in the program on the, or rather the title of today's conversation, Precarity, Collectivity, and Inhabitation. And then, of course, don't limit yourself to that one. Feel free to be as wide-ranging as you want to be. And then open up the floor to talk about how those concepts help us think about cities in general, and to the extent that most of us have a variety of different experiences of cities in India, to what extent those concepts and issues travel to the kinds of experiences that we have had dealing with Indian cities. So, floor's yours, as long as you wish. Okay. I'll switch the slot.
Thank you, Partha. So I guess this is the real show. Instead of the one down the block. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm basically going to try to address this through talking about three stories of particular forms of built environments in a city of which I've been working in over the past decade of Jakarta. And the three stories have something to do with the process of telling stories and generating stories. Because in significant ways, cities have always been about the production of stories. After all, I mean, this is what cities are primarily about. It's stories leading to other stories, leading to other stories, and how are stories told and constructed. And to use these three just snapshots as a way to identify points of concern and contestation in terms of the trajectories of urban development, perhaps not just in Jakarta, perhaps it has applications elsewhere. First one, two weeks ago, a market called Pasar Rumput in the center of Jakarta burned down. It is likely, in all probability, in all certainty, that it was intentionally burned down. If it wasn't burned down, it was going to be torn down at some point anyway. And Pasar Rumput is a place of which people feel a great deal of ambivalence toward. It is a fairly run-down, naughty place. It was a place where an aspiring middle class could go to buy things really cheap, to keep their expenditures down. It was a place where you would go to try to understand, where people in the surrounding areas would go to understand something about how these surrounding neighborhoods were really run. Who has the real power? Who has the real influence? What's happening? The market became a kind of nerve center to, in some ways, have access to stories about the larger environment in which residents were a part. It was a place full of cheap goods at night, cheap clubs, cheap bars, brothels, a place full of cheap beauty parlors. It was a place where even the poor could go and affordably get their hair done and look good. It was a place where labor brokers would meet what they call the mandors, the construction brokers who managed the sort of labor force for big construction projects. It was a place where they would go before to work out deals, before they would go meet the big developers in the big fancy hotels. It was a place of all-night card games where military guys and police and brokers would come from all over the city for all-night card games, where they would in some sense get a sense of the pulse of what was going on in the city. And of course it was not a very reputable place. Of course it was full of these kinds of ambivalent feelings. It was a kind of eyesore, surrounded by an encroaching CBD of spectacular buildings. And of course, one expected that it had to go at some point. And what becomes somewhat problematic is that this Pasar Rumput was basically a machine of stories. It was a way in which stories were generated, and more importantly, a way in which stories were articulated to each other. It was a kind of crossroads of intersections, of impressions and rumors and formulations and provisional analyses. It was a kind of sense where no matter who you were, you had some kind of access. You had confidence in having some kind of access, that there within that market, you'd have some kind of knowledge about something. You'd have access to some kind of sense larger than the kind of knowledge you had access to in conversations in your family, conversations you might have at work. It was a kind of arena, a kind of a knowledge production arena. Somehow the authorities seem to know this, because in some ways the market's burned down, and then the intent is to build social housing to house people that are being evicted. Poor people are being evicted along riverbanks because of the governor's new program to flood mitigation program to widen the river. And of course, flood mitigation programs never mitigate floods generally. In riverine areas, the only way that you can deal with floods is basically to get affected people out quickly from harm's way. Every time you assemble these kinds of massive engineering projects, you in the end make flooding worse. But in some ways, the political machine has to demonstrate its ability to exert control over the larger environment and to control flooding. To be seen as controlling flooding generates a great deal of political capital, no matter whether or not you actually do it or not. So Pasar Rumput then becomes the site of a kind of new social housing, which gets some support for the lower income population, because usually people who are evicted from the urban core find themselves at the periphery of the city, basically in huge towers of incarceration. I know for those of you who, I don't know Delhi very well, but I've seen in Mumbai these kind of prison systems where people are basically placed in so-called temporary housing. So this is different. This is in some way providing social housing for the low income within the center, and they're going to build a new market attached to it. So unlike other social housing for people who are evicted that somehow disrupt their economic livelihoods, here there's intended to be a new market, but a market that is going to be very precisely administered, regulated, and controlled by the municipal authority. Within Jakarta, this is a huge issue, because like in many cities, marketing is the purview of the municipality. It is part of their competency, it's part of their responsibility. But decades ago, the municipality, for all practical purposes, lost control over the marketing system, and markets provisioning wholesale fruit and vegetable markets in Jakarta largely became the purview of self-managed associations, of which the municipalities have been trying to retain control of ever since. So this becomes a kind of opportunity to demonstrate that you are housing the poorest of the poor within the urban core, and you're attaching a market to it in some sense to provide those kinds of economic activities. But that market is going to be heavily regulated by the municipality. So in some ways, it becomes a kind of complicated story, because it's very difficult to say, okay, look it, somehow in order for the economic activities of low-income people to work, that it has to look at a particular way. The challenge is how do you develop new kinds of spatial products for the poor, supportive of their livelihoods, without thinking that you have to retain the kind of informal materiality that we usually associate with low income areas. So it's very difficult to be against this kind of project. It's very difficult to say, oh, this shouldn't take place just because you disrupt something which which had this kind of status of being the generator and purveyor of multiple stories and the intersection of multiple stories. So it becomes one particular kind of problematic, which politically, how do you affiliate with this? And what happens then to the kind of, what kinds of spaces then are available that somehow replace the kinds of functions that Pasar Rumput had, even though it was in some ways an eyesore and became a kind of disreputable place. So that's one problematic story. The second story I want to raise is a way in which a narrative begins to develop amongst different kinds of fragments that otherwise don't have a kind of coherent, overarching narrative line which connects them. And the way in which a new generation of emergent autoconstruction at the periphery begins to, in a very small and emergent way, become a kind of narrative line which begins to try to connect very discrepant kinds of spatial environments, built environments, at the periphery of the city. So, for example, in the eastern periphery of the Jakarta metropolitan region, you have a periphery whose complexion is basically all over the place. You still have a great deal of agricultural land, which is very important in terms of providing for the urban market. That is, when I talked about like those wholesale fruit and vegetable markets before, most of the fruits and vegetables that they access come from the periphery, come from the near periphery. So there's the continued viability of that kind of agricultural land, servicing, being primary providers of these markets. These markets then distribute to local neighborhood markets, of which there are about 250 of them throughout the city. But again, it's a kind of precarious, vulnerable situation, because also contiguous to these farms are large-scale agricultural holdings that are being sold off for the potential of large industrial development. So sizable chunks of land that are being turned into the platform for potential investments, inward foreign direct investments, in terms of anticipating a kind of large-scale industrialization within that area, which is yet to come. But this industrial land is incredibly valuable, and increasingly valuable. Now, this kind of industrial land and farmland is also then contiguous to a kind of generation of so-called affordable housing that was rolled out about 10 or 15 years ago. And this is kind of typical kind of peri-urban, lower aspirant middle-class housing, which is basically pavilion style structures, the same, exactly the same, and the houses are basically linked. So you have a row of houses, like you've seen the famous ones outside of Mexico City, where it's just a line of like 100 houses in a row attached, maybe 42 square meters at most, which an aspirant middle class bought into 10 or 15 years ago, anticipating that they were in the line, that the city was coming towards them, that they were within the kind of river of urbanization that was going to move toward them. But it hasn't happened yet. And they still find themselves, in some sense, in the middle of nowhere, and also with a built plant with homes that are falling apart. I mean, they're not worth anything anymore. They're decaying, but yet this is the asset that they have, and they don't know quite what to do. Now, these sort of affordable housing were part of the 20% of affordable housing that was part of the deal when developers tried to build new towns. So new towns for sort of upper middle class. The rules were that if you built these kind of upper middle class sub-cities, gated areas, that you'd have to devote 20 to 25% to this kind of affordable housing. These gated sub-cities at the periphery, which were fully occupied 10 years ago, are now barely 50% occupied, as those residents have now moved back to the urban core because there's been more housing choices provided in the urban core, and they also find it's not worth it being at the periphery. So you have these big, huge physical new city plants which are half empty, and developers don't exactly know what to do with them. So in some sense, they're being rented out very cheaply, almost for nothing, to a whole series of new migrants coming into the regional system with really no place to go. So you have then a great deal of tensions between those middle class families who can't afford to move back into the urban core, and a new population of migrants coming in, and all kinds of conflicts and contestations in this kind of new composition. In the interstices of this, in the interstices of farmland, new industrial estates, so-called affordable housing, part of the proportion that was required in order to build these new towns which are of precarious viability. In the interstices, within land which has still ambiguous status, because one has to also realize that constitutionally in Indonesia, land belongs to no one. In the Constitution, land belongs to absolutely no one. In the final end, it belongs to some kind of category called the people, rakyat. Okay? Now, it doesn't stop Jakarta from having the largest and most pernicious real estate market in Southeast Asia. But constitutionally, land has all kinds of ambiguous statuses. And so within certain villages at the interstices of these different spatial products, you see another generation of autoconstruction taking place. And it's autoconstruction basically being within associations of small developers who are beginning on their own to build 3 to 4 story apartment blocks. And these developing, in some sense, a new kind of auto-constructed community with links to all of these different other spatial products, links to the agricultural center, links to being workers within the industrial plants, links to, in some ways, the gated sub-cities, providing them with all kinds of new workshops, new kinds of products, fabrications, cheap fabrications, affordable. So within the interstices of these spatial products arises a new generation of autoconstruction based on making things and supporting a kind of population that provides a kind of narrative line, a tentative, provisional, emergent narrative line between the fragments, between all of these fragments at the periphery, which seemingly have very little to do with each other, that seem to be disarticulated to each other. And so you have a different kind of storyline taking place at the periphery, again, emergent and provisional, which is in some sense a particular important emergent urban formation, okay, at the periphery. So what happens with that? How does one think about that? How does one conceptualize that? What in some way can one anticipate that within 10 years that this is all going to be overrun by industrial development? Or is the city going to expand residentially so that you're going to have, in some sense, high end? And the other. Okay, so that's the second thing I want to say. Third thing I want to say is, usually when we tell stories, storytelling tends to have the kinds of responsibilities that stories should link to each other. Stories should be about other stories. That the story, that some way a story makes sense only if you can find a way to link your story into it. That stories become open to include you in some way. That you can find some kind of connection to the story being told. So there's a kind of responsibility about storytelling, which one story leads to another. The story is valuable in the sense to which it opens up onto the possibility of other stories, that people find their way into it. Because in some sense, I mean, I've spent the last 10 years basically trying to understand the kind of operating systems of working class and lower middle class districts within Jakarta, very heterogeneous districts in terms of the composition of the population, in terms of the economic activities that are taking place, and what people would say all the time is that what's most important to them is the sense to be able to keep going. That is, it doesn't matter what things look like so much. It doesn't matter, what they're doing in terms of job. It doesn't matter who their neighbors are. For them, the important thing was to be able to keep going, to always see within the city the possibility of one thing that could lead to another thing. That you wouldn't face an impasse, that you wouldn't face a kind of barrier when you confront it, that you don't know exactly what to do, that you don't run out of alternatives. In fact, one of the reasons people said that they really valued living in really mixed up districts was that when their particular way of doing things didn't work, at least they were surrounded by people doing different things, that they could get ideas about other things that they could be doing. That they wouldn't face this kind of impasse, that there would be a way to keep going. And in some ways, then, this is in some sense what I'm trying to say about stories become a kind of vehicle. The story keeps going. It doesn't reach an end point. To a certain extent, you find a different kind of trajectory of a story where the story is indifferent to who it affects and how. That is, there's a particular way, there's a particular rollout and production, rollout of spatial production in Jakarta, which in some sense tells a story, but it's a story that is not able to connect to any kind of pre-existent story. In fact, it has no desire to. In fact, it doesn't really care. It's indifferent to where it ends up. It doesn't matter to this particular kind of story what the destination is. In fact, rather it tries to consolidate as many different kinds of resources, as many different kinds of possibilities, in order to produce what I would say instigate a future for which it doesn't have a map or a language yet. And that's its power. That is, for example, in the Bay of Jakarta, there are a group of islands. And there's one island called Island G. And in Island G, last year they built a series of 750 shop houses. Now, shop house is basically a three-story thing where on the bottom floor you have a shop, then the second floor is where you count the money, and on the third is where the household lives, or there's a storage. You have 750 of these. There was nothing on this island before. It's connected by a kind of bridge. The developer, one of Jakarta's major developers, and this all took place under the radar. It all took place illegally and almost invisibly. So there's a whole controversy about how was it possible that these 750 shop houses were built. In fact, when the national minister responsible for this explicitly forbade any kind of developments on these islands. There's no viability at all at present in terms of these 750 shop houses. In fact, the developer isn't worried at all whether or not they're profitable or not. Rather, the developer rather sees this as part of the rush to build. That is, within Jakarta, there is this kind of, if you talk to developers, there is this absolutely sense of exigency to build now, the rush to build. Now, part of the rush to build is understandable. You have to, in some sense, deal with escalating land prices. Example, for most of the so-called affordable housing that is built, it's the game where you sell all the apartment units before they're even built. You take the money and then you go on to the next project. So you're always worried about land availability at the price. You're always worried about the availability of labor. Is there enough labor? How do you manage to get labor at a certain kind of price? How do you deal with different exchange rates in terms of foreign currency? How do you mobilize particular finance? How do you deal with an increasingly complex regulatory environment? All of these things, in some ways, understandably, account for this kind of sense of exigency, the rush to build. But you talk to developers and you talk to people involved in these development projects, and you find the extent that they're indifferent whether or not something works now or not. They don't care about the profitability within the present. What's more concerned with them is that they see this kind of outlaying of spatial products, this kind of rush to build things, not just simply in speculation. Of course it's speculation, but it even is more extreme than that. It's a kind of instigation of a future. They know somewhere along the line that they'll bring something about. A story will be created. They have no idea really what the story will be. You talk to the guys, and they're guys who built on Island G. They can't tell you what it's going to look like in 5 years. I mean, they can give you a kind of story about it, but when you really press, they have no idea and they don't care. All they know is that they do something to bring something about for which they don't have a map yet, for which they don't have a story yet, really. And then you see within the Jakarta region the results of this kind of expenditure, this kind of instigation of a future for which yet there is a kind of map, which a storyline which is indifferent to the real needs of residents, the real aspirations of residents, what's come before. any kind of sense of does this new development have any kind of historical articulation, any kind of link to a kind of master plan, to a spatial development plan, to a kind of how you're going to provide bulk infrastructure. There's a kind of increased indifference because of this sense of exigency. Do it now or you're not going to be able to do it. That sense of a kind of environment. So this is a different kind of a story. It's a different kind of a disposition of urban development. And so one begins to wonder, how do you then put together? How do you put together the kind of fire at Pasar Rumput, the kind of destruction of a kind of space which itself was a kind of node of articulation between a larger surrounds, which provided a kind of base of knowledge, a way of putting into circulation knowledge about the kind of real politic of the urban core, and its destruction and its substitution by a kind of attempt to house the poor within the urban core and provide a kind of built environment that will support a kind of economic livelihood. And then how do you put that together with a kind of overly fragmented periphery where you don't know quite which way the periphery is going? Is it going toward increased industrial development? Is it going to be the kind of site for massive amounts of affordable housing? I mean, between now and 2011, Jakarta will see 1 million new units of vertical, high-rise, so-called affordable housing coming in online. Is that going to be the future of the periphery? What happens if you eliminate agricultural land? What happens to keeping the price affordable for a middle class, which is middle class in name only? I mean, when you look exactly how much they earn per month, the World Bank will say it's middle class, but it's $200 a month. I mean, that's a kind of very precarious middle class that may feel middle class, but when it comes to putting food on the table, it depends on that agricultural land. What happens there? And then what's the relationship between that and a kind of well-oiled machine in some way, politically supported where the metropolitan governance system just doesn't pay attention to it, which is unrolling spatial products which in some ways go beyond rationality in a way, not simply based on speculation or profitability, but are instruments to instigate a kind of future for which there's not yet a kind of map for. So in that sense, this is my way of trying to intervene into the concepts which put on the top of the paper.